Hello, everyone, and welcome to Collapse Club, where we talk about how to live in the time of collapse. I'm David Baum in Seattle. With me today is Kat Soares, my friend and mentor from the Deep Adaptation Forum. Hello, Kat, how are you?
Hello, David. It's such a pleasure to be here with you.
Could you tell us, I'm sorry, yes. Could you tell us where you are and how things are there, please?
I live in the north of Aberdeenshire in Scotland, so quite far north, so almost 60 degrees. How are things? It's still winter. We're yet to have a proper winter, very little snow, lots of wind, uncharacteristically powerful winds. But I'm very lucky. I'm sitting in a beautifully insulated house with a log fire burning and two sleeping dogs on the floor. And things are good.
That sounds so nice. Well, we are here to talk about deep adaptation. My involvement goes back to 2019. The thing about deep adaptation for me, there are many things, but the one thing that stands out above all else is it is based in love. And there is something special about the relationship of love to facing up to our world situation. And I wonder if you could talk about how important loving responses to the prospect of collapse are in the work of deep adaptation.
It's a great question, David. And there are a multitude of different ways
There's so many
to
things
respond
to talk
to that.
about, yeah.
So I'll answer it from a personal perspective. Like you, I've been involved in deep adaptation since early 2019. In fact, I think you may have been one of my first collaborators in that space.
We were there together early.
And I didn't understand then the focus on loving responses, really. I didn't get it. It felt a bit amorphous, a bit fuzzy, a bit far away. Now I absolutely get it. For me, it feels really important because as things become increasingly difficult, and they are for so many people, in fact, for the vast majority of the world, they have been difficult for a long time, but we're starting to be affected in our luxurious, well-resourced countries. As things become increasingly difficult, there's a tendency to batten down the hatches, to close the door, to become very self-centered, to become very self-orientated, to become very protective and very defensive and that's a normal psychological response to threat and to danger. By cultivating loving responses, not just to people beyond yourself, but to yourself. This is tough stuff that we deal with, right? We need to be loving and patient with ourselves as well. By cultivating that as a habit, maybe we reduce the propensity for disproportionate or aggressive or defensive behavior. Maybe we're able to cultivate compassion along with love and care and sharing. So it feels like it's very, very important.
Compassion is a word that comes up a lot. I find that it is central to my understanding of how to proceed in these days. Everything needs to come from feeling of the other, which is the literal meaning of the word compassion. It really is about opening those channels and making those relationships and connections. Here's a question about deep adaptation. You mentioned that it starts internally, that we need to love ourselves. One controversy that has dogged the community over time is this about us or is this about the world? Is it about being or doing? Is it about our internal state or is it about changing the world? Where have you come to after these several years of working with the community?
You're right about the tensions that exist between those two perspectives. They're very present all the time. My curiosity immediately goes to, what if the being is the doing and vice versa? So why do we see this as them as being mutually exclusive? They clearly aren't mutually exclusive. When we be, and our consciousness grows in terms of who we are in the world and how we are moved by the world, how we move through the world, the influences we have, then our doing becomes different. Maybe it becomes more effective. Maybe it becomes more sensitive. Maybe it becomes more real. So I think if you leap straight into doing, we're accustomed to having the illusion of power and influence and autonomy and agency. It's what we're trained for from the time that we're tiny. If we leap straight into doing, I think we're missing something really fundamental, because we're not shifting the relationship. We're not shifting away from a power over paradigm, as Pat McCabe would say. When we do the inner work at the same time, or even ahead of facing outwards, then that paradigm is shifted. And so for me, definitely doing the inner work, the being work, is really central to who I am now. It's become part of my regular practice. And I see that in lots of members within deep adaptation. I also feel the angst of people who are perhaps newly collapse aware. There's that tension that rises in your body, and that urgency starts to kick in, and we have to do something, and we have to do it now. But if we do the wrong things, or if we do them with the wrong intention, then we can do harm. So yeah, I don't think being and doing are two separate things. I think that they are intricately intertwined.
Speaking of doing, could you describe the structure or the sort of embodiment of the deep adaptation community? I think it has several levels and a couple of different sort of expressions and projects. What does the community look like now, today?
It's funny, I can create an image in my mind. Articulating it is perhaps difficult, but I'll try. So essentially, we are leaderless, but leaderful. So that's the intention is. Perhaps people will recognize language like an ecocentric network rather than an egocentric network. So in an ecocentric network, people kind of coalesce around a purpose or an idea. But how they respond and enact themselves in response to that idea is not dictated from on high. So there are layers within the forum, within deep adaptation as a community, but they're not formal and they're not directive, if that makes sense. So we have a holding group, which I guess would be the equivalent of a board of directors if we were actually a company operating in old business as usual paradigms. But I think of them more as a circle of elders. So these are people who come with incredible skills across a range of disciplines: psychology, education, finance, you name it, those categories are represented in that space. And the meetings are not like board meetings at all. There's a lot of sensing and feeling. There's lots of exploration. And the role of the holding group is really to provide guidance. So they don't dictate, they don't make decisions and hand them down. Anything can be taken to the holding group, and they can be invited to bring their collective wisdom to bear in order to influence the decision making. The day-to-day decision making in terms of what platforms are we operating on and how are we supporting this, and those decisions are made within the core team, which at the present time is 4 people. It was very recently 5, but we have now a vacant position in there. And we each have a set of responsibilities. They're all listed on the website. So if people are curious about the core team, if they click that link on the DAF info at DAF website, they will see what the core responsibilities are. So we have a person who's responsible for network weaving, for holding the relationships, for supporting the development of those relationships over time. We have someone who takes responsibility for events and facilitating the many offerings that we are now emerging and being offered within the community. We have a comms person who supports the blog and our internal and external communication channels. And then you have me, who's my name is coordinator, but I'm not the boss. It's just I coordinate, I help people find synergies, and we work together and try to do what we can. Fundamentally, the core team, while they have power, are in service of the community. And the community is vast. So we have some people who would turn up regularly and are really in there, sleeves up, making stuff happen, fixing websites, writing papers, hosting events, convening circles for conversation. And we have from that extreme all the way down to people who are perhaps members of the Facebook group. So they're curious, perhaps they're not really engaged as yet. They turn up, they participate in conversation via social media. So there's a real range in terms of the members. One thing we've struggled with as a core team is how do we support emergence within that community? So I hear a lot of people asking or saying DAF should do this, deep adaptation should do that, deep adaptation should do this, what we should be doing. And I want to find a way of saying to people and supporting people in realizing that they are deep adaptation. And if something needs to happen or they have fueled by a passion, then start something, find your tribe, have those conversations, start a circle, gather together, do what it is that you feel is most important in the moment. And we, as the core team and other experienced volunteers, will do what we can to support that. So it's, in terms of structure, it's very informal, it's very flat. So there are people who hold the keys to the kingdom, if you like. I have the passwords for the various accounts, but my power extends nowhere after that. It's really about responsibility rather than about seniority, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question, David?
It does. That gives a sketch of how it's put together. Do you think that deep adaptation as an organization or as a community is accomplishing what it is meant to do in the world?
I noticed straight away there's that rising voice that goes, of course it is. So I'm just going to temper that for a moment. I think that you would get a different answer depending on who you were speaking to. So there are clearly people within the community who have different aspirations, I suppose, but I can only speak from my own experience. Deep adaptation and my participation, both as a volunteer and an active member and now as a core team coordinator, has been absolutely transformational for me. Personally, it has been transformational. And what I hear from the people I work with, that I move through the world with outside of deep adaptation, is that change is noticeable. And so I'm implementing practices that I learned in deep adaptation with my work team, with the various advisory groups that I work with and on, government advisory panels that I sit on. And I'm taking those processes and introducing them, and they're transforming the way those decisions are being made. So that it's spreading, if you like, a bit like the nasty coronavirus, which has been with us for quite a long time. So in that regard, I think deep adaptation is having a tremendous impact. Could we be being more vocal, more activist, I suppose is the word. Could we be doing more of that? Probably. But we're dealing with a really delicate subject. We're talking about the collapse of human systems, of societies. That's really threatening for people who are not collapse aware. And there's a risk inherent in pontificating or preaching or screaming that message from on high. It might raise a lot of attention. It could lead to radical changes in the way that societies are functioning and decisions are being made at large, and it could lead to radical improvements in the way our environments are being managed and the way that we're doing business. It could just as easily get us sidelined and shut up, get us closed down. So there's a balance in how much of that and how we do that. And my sense is it's growing over time. and it will continue to grow over time as consciousness generally is raising. I don't feel any urgency about it, but I'm sure there are members who really do.
Thank you. Before we go on, your microphone is rubbing on your gorgeous
on my
scarf.
scarf.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Let me
Beautiful. That's
hold
fine.
it.
Yeah. Or just, yeah, that's cool. Thank you. On the side of doing, there is a substantial segment, I think, of the deep adaptation community that is about living on the land or finding a place on the earth that feels like home. I think you yourself have recently moved. There's a group called Practical DA that's about homesteading and farming and gardening. What's the relationship between people who do the inner work of sort of understanding themselves and their emotional setup and those who want to know how to raise seeds in given climates?
It's a really good question. What is the relationship? There will be areas of overlap between the groups of people who are identifying as doing the inner stuff and who are practically applying themselves to resilience and growing food, etc. But it isn't formalized. There hasn't ever been an intention to bring those groups closer together or to seek areas of overlap and synergy. My intuition is that it's organic, that for some people, some of our members won't be interested in doing the inner work. They won't be interested. They'll hear the love in deep adaptation and go, yeah, but I'm busy. I've got beans to plant. And similarly, there may be members who are so internally focused that the idea of planting a garden, or they may not feel able, they might not feel they have the capacity. So there will naturally be a disconnect, but there'll be a disconnect in other places too. And I'm not sure that that's a negative thing. There'll be people who are very focused on business and finance. You're aware of the discussion group. So what I didn't say when we were talking about the structure is that's the formal part of the structure, but actually there are probably dozens of circles now operating and working together around things that are important to them. So there are people who are gathering around a thriving life paradigm and having conversations about what is this and how do we apply it. There is a diversity and decolonizing circle. There's a business and finance group. There's a interfaith group. There's a film circle. There are people, there's a music circle. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of conversations going on all the time. And there's no formal connection between any of those groups. It's not designed that way, but neither are there formal barriers. So it's very organic. People move between those spaces. My hope would be that people will move between those spaces and find where they feel most comfortable, but not be limited to one or another. Sorry.
No, I'm trying to formulate a question that gets to the many groups and the many topics. They all come from the same central influence. To find a loving response and to make connection with other people who are engaged in the same quest. That's how I would sort of say it. And I wonder if I could get you to reflect a little bit about why it's so important to be in touch with other people on this topic, why the connections are so critical to the mission of deep adaptation.
There have been literally thousands of philosophers and writers and thinkers over the ages who have spoken about the importance of relationship, the importance of connection. No man is an island, etc., etc. You know, I think about these terribly wealthy people who are building bunkers in places like New Zealand and stockpiling all the things they may need to see them through the coming apocalypse. And it may be just them and their families, and they're not engaging with anyone. They have power and they have influence, they have money. They don't need to. When we're well resourced, we're not very good at sharing because we don't need to. When we're without resources, there are two options. We can either isolate ourselves, or more commonly, where resources are deficient or in short supply, we operate in community. We support one another. We share what we have. These people who are terribly well resourced and can afford to do it on their own, what do they do when the business as usual system unravels? When their money that they pay their guards who stand with guns in front of their food lockers, when that money has no relevance, like it just simply doesn't make sense. The structures that have dictated our society will become irrelevant. So what else is there? Well, fundamentally, we're tribal. We've evolved to be tribal. And I love the theory and the spirit of Ubuntu, which we learn from Nontokozo, who works with us on diversity and decolonizing. None of us are okay as long as any of us are not okay. So we can only be okay when we're all okay. So build relationships, get to know other people, open your minds and your hearts to other perspectives, to other ways of knowing, to other ways of experiencing. Decenter yourself. And you do that in relationship with other people. Honest, genuine connection with other people is how you decenter yourself. So relationships are absolutely fundamental. And I don't think any of us are arrogant enough to imagine that we have the answer to all the questions. And maybe we don't need absolute answers. Maybe what we need are like-minded people who get where we are to have conversations with. Maybe we never find the answers, you know? But there's a comfort in being heard. There's a comfort in being held metaphorically while you explore your inner landscape and I think some of the power of deep adaptation is in exactly that. It's in having spaces where people can experience being fully heard and the joy of really hearing other people.
I've recently started to notice a theme in the conversations on this channel about breaking the mask that we're forced to wear by the society that we've come up in, breaking that mask and finding our authentic face and learning to present our authentic self to the world. Having to face up to the prospect of collapse is traumatic, but it can be very effective in breaking the systems that we live in, that we have made for ourselves. It can break them pretty definitively and leaving us in a state of confusion and trauma, pain, difficulty, and then to find other people who have gone through that already, who have lost their support systems, gone through grief, gone through despair, and found something on the other side that makes life worth living, even in the face of collapse. That's how deep adaptation functioned for me and my participation in the community. Does that sound right to you? Is it a group of people looking for their authentic selves? Is that what's really going on?
I think there are many people who found their authentic selves through being engaged with other members of the Deep Adaptation Forum. I don't know if that was ever the deliberate design, if you like. But certainly, as you've described it, David, that's how deep adaptation has been for me and indeed continues to be for me. I've touched, it's funny, as a young woman, I used to go out to fancy coffee shops and sit on the balcony. I lived in Australia and sip my coffee and just watch the world go by. And I used to have this experience of going, I wanted to knock on people. Is there anybody in there? You know, there's this kind of this prescription, isn't there, that we must look a certain way, we must behave a certain way. There's language that's expected of us. And you're right, that we, without even realizing it, we are conditioned and molded to be something that is very unnatural. It's exhausting, absolutely exhausting. And so finding the center of yourself, your authenticity, touching that and then living from that place is less tiring. It's not. I want to say it's not easy because we live with a reality or a specter of a terrifying specter for the future. So it's not all sweetness and light and joy, but there's some comfort in knowing who you really are. So yeah, I think reconnecting with the self is a fundamental step on the journey towards where we're going.
And joining with other people in that journey. To me, that's been the great lesson. What I've learned, as we were talking before we went live, I learned to shut up and listen in deep adaptation. When I first arrived, I was like, oh, I figured some stuff out, and boy, I'm going to tell all these folks what I know. And I got on a couple of meetings, and first of all, that wasn't tolerated. And also, I realized that there are people here who know more than me, and I should listen. So being with others who are going through this, have gone through it, have their own wisdom, that's the value that's the value that I found in the deep adaptation experience.
And there is a tremendous comfort to be found in that experience. And for me, part of becoming more fully myself, I guess, was holding on to what I thought I knew much less tightly. Because when I'm not trying to manage this facade of being the person that I'm supposed to be, behaving the way I'm supposed to behave, following the life trajectory that's been predetermined for me, somehow I can hold everything less tightly. And that's an enormous benefit. And again, it makes it a lot easier to listen to all of those other sources of wisdom.
Well, on a prosaic note, to end our time together today, what are you looking forward to in the Deep Adaptation Forum? What is coming up for the community and the group?
Well, coming back to that question about emergence and supporting more emergence within the community, we've been having some conversations at Core Team about what are some of the things we could do to be enabling that and supporting that, so that it's easier for people to find their place and find their folk. And you know, David, that we hosted 6 online open space events in 2021.
Yeah, those are great. Open space is a great format. Sorry.
And a lot of new initiatives were born out of those open space events. So now we're playing with the ideas around that have come from sociocracy. Around at our next open space event, the invitation will be to come along and launch a conversation as you typically would in an open space event, but with an added dimension in that we'd like these conversations to be the first of a series of conversations. So rather than coming along for 2 or 3 hours, having a great conversation, walking away and not taking that anywhere, the invitation will be to form circles that will commit to working together for a few months, to meet regularly, and we will support that with infrastructure and with tech support and with to enable people to coalesce around the things that are really important to them, and then get some traction, maintain those relationships. And I know you and I have definitely had this experience where you'll be in a conversation, it feels amazing when you're in there, right? It's so exciting, your whole body becomes enlivened. You finish the event, you go, I feel amazing, this is wonderful. But 2 days later, you're back at your desk, you're doing your job, and that is forgotten. It's just a lovely memory. So the invitation is to form a relationship, form some relationships, maintain them over time, see what emerges, see where you end up. So I'm excited about that. The other thing I'm excited about is trying to, you and I had it easy, David, when we started in deep adaptation. It didn't have this level of complexity. What we have now is quite a complex ecosystem, and it's overwhelming and bewildering for people who are just landing. So I'm really keen this year to try and create more doorways. In fact, I'd like to take all the walls down completely, but how we do that, I don't know. More access points, more ways in, so that when people do arrive, new, disorientated, thoroughly overwhelmed at this thing that they've landed in, we demystify it somehow, and it becomes much more open and much more transparent. And the new DAF space that's currently being decided may well be one of the keys to realizing that ambition.
And it's all so difficult in these days when you can't follow up on the contacts you make with a meeting in person because of the pandemic. All of our activity in deep adaptation while I was there had to take place online. And there were a few sort of efforts to get together, but if you can't meet, if you can't get in the same room and feel the energy and meet people and look in their eyes and give them a hug, those connections have a hard time cohering. Harder, I think. It's possible, but
yeah. So we did a deep live gathering last year in October, where there were simultaneously small gatherings, local gatherings dotted across the planet, and they hooked up remotely through Zoom, so that it felt like a much bigger event, a global event taking place in nodes, if you like. And plans are underway to repeat that exercise again this year, again in October. So, and there are a group of people who've already done it now, so they've got a little bit of experience, and the doors will be open so that anybody, if you're in Seattle and you decide you'd like to convene a local live event for folk who are nearby or who would like to travel to you, or indeed if you would like to travel further afield than your neighborhood, promoting some face-to-face events. I've been lucky enough to meet 2 of my collaborators in deep adaptation in person. It was utterly delightful. So you're absolutely right that being in the presence of someone is really important. So yeah, keep an eye out for the deep live conversations and plans, preparations for that coming in the autumn. Our autumn, the spring in the Southern Hemisphere.
the deep live gathering, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Great. And for more information, people can go to the website at deepadaptation.info. Yes?
That's right. Yes, absolutely.
And the link is in the description below the video here.
Thank you, David.
Well, Kat, nice to talk to you. Again, we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more. People can sample the various offerings, the various meetings and meditations and teachings that happen in deep adaptation. And of course, the Facebook group has 14,000 some members now. So
Yep.
there are discussions of all kinds there. It's a great way to get into the collapse aware world and to meet other people who are coping with the same things that you are coping with, that one copes with. So
Quite right. David, thank you. It's been a privilege. And thank you for doing this and for all the other things that you've been doing for the last few years. Deep adaptation doesn't exist without all of us doing our little bit, and your little bit has not been insignificant.
Very good. Thank you so much. That's it for this episode of Collapse Club. Those watching, please subscribe, like this episode if you liked it. And until we meet again, farewell.